sauce is the key, we whipping it up. The sauce is the key, we cooking it up. The sauce is the key, we cooking it up. Hey, hey, hey.
Everybody, welcome back to another edition of The Sauce. Andrew, how was your weekend? Good? Everything good?
Weekend was great. Played some golf. I'm a big golfer, everybody that doesn't know. You would think I would be an incredible golfer because I play a lot. I'm not. I'm mid 80s to low 80s, but I have a blast. And when you get older and get to be what they would say in Yiddish, an alta kacker like me, there's not too many more sports that you can play and be proficient at. And that's one of them.
Well, all the years we've known each other, we've never played golf together. We're going to have to correct that.
Okay, let's
we'll have to get out. I go through spurts, right? I play for a couple of years, like all the time, and then I just don't play at all for like 2 years. It's like I just tend to get busy with other stuff. I guess that's the problem with not being good at something too, is that you tend to not really want to commit and buckle down. I've tried. I've done lessons. I've done everything. I'm not going to embarrass myself. Well, maybe.
You might, Rabbit. You might.
Yeah, I mean, it's golf. You're always going to embarrass yourself. But
so
I was guessing you have a great topic I think we want to chat about this week. And I think this is a really good a good topic for executives, particularly business owners, because we deal with this all the time where we've all probably heard that, what it takes to get a company to, let's say, 10 million is completely and totally different than what it takes to get at 50, and is completely and totally different when it's at 100 or 200 or 300 million. And many times investors tend to think that you just have to replace, right? You can't be a CEO that scales up with your organization, but I think there's certain characteristics and things you can do to prepare yourself for that level of growth. But let's chat about that because you brought it up this week. I think it's a really interesting topic. What's your perspective on this? I think there's so many different ways you can look at it, and there's different skill sets and industries, but I think there's some general topics that we can talk about here.
So my first thing that I think about when if you were to ask me that question, is actually not so much the hard skills, it's the mindset and the mental skills and the level of true introspection that a person has. I find that, I've consulted to, in my capacity in customer experience and even culture and coaching, that the mindset of a leader of somebody 10 million and under is very different than the mindset of those 50 million and under than those higher. So what is that? And, I could talk about that for a while, but that's my first reaction. I would go into that kind of thing. I find that people of small or micro businesses, 10 million, are usually those that started it from their garage or an idea. And it doesn't mean that they needed to go to school. It really means that they probably should have read a few books on leadership, on operations, on business itself to know how to elevate themselves. But, on the mindset game.
But Andrew, let me just jump in there really quickly. That's tough to do because you're doing the work usually under 10 million, right? You're shoulder to shoulder a lot of times with the people.
You're in the business as opposed
You're very much in the business. And I know this is that old adage, on the business versus in the business. And it can vary wildly, right? I mean, my consulting firm, I'm starting to move more towards on versus in because I have resources internally that can do some of the in, so I can do that. We're well under that 10 million mark, but it really just depends upon the business, and it's just understanding where you are, right? Understanding where I love to say, and you and I both speak at Arizona Growth Advisors, each year, and I like to say you got to know who wags the dog here, right? Are you a sales-driven organization, operations-driven organization? Are you an organization that can delegate? You just have to understand who you are. And I think who you are as the organization gets bigger becomes less and less about who you are and more about who the company is.
Okay.
And
so
that is where the
into-
transition happens, right?
That's brilliant. And that's where I would go to in the mindset. You know, one of the things I've always said when I speak is whatever success I have achieved in my life, and there were times in my life I've achieved some pretty big things. It really never came out of what I did and how well I did it. It really came out of who I decided to be. And I think if you extend that to your company as though it was a living, breathing entity, right? Who is this company? You know, who do we want to be? You know, and then how are we going to do that? You know, I think it takes that vision and that extension of the mind on the who part. I don't think that many people individually decide. Now, let me give you an example real quick, and then you can dive in. You know this story, Derrick, but I grew up in this remarkable home where my parents were madly in love and openly affectionate. And my brother and I were the center of the universe. And I thought all that was normal. And what I also thought was normal, that they lived their lives in service. And it wasn't connected to a particular faith, but it was, my home was Grand Central Station for anybody that needed a meal or a place to stay. It was the place of joy, love, laughter, and safety for the world. Again, I thought all this was normal. But what was imposed upon me was to really decide who I wanted to be in this world first, rather than what I wanted to do with my life and the things I wanted to have, right? So I decided that I wanted to be a person like my parents, to more live my life in service to others. Hence why I'm now a consultant and I'm in culture and customer experience, serving others, right? And that, who I decided I wanted to be, shaped the things that I was passionate about, how good I became at it, and then the outcomes had a way of showing up more for me because of the who. So I think what you bring up really, I think, escapes many of those small business owners at that level.
Yeah. And listen, this is an exercise I'm going through myself right now, because I am, you know, sitting here with a couple different consulting firms that are, you know, successful in their own right now. And I'm asking myself, what do those want to be when they grow up? And I say that very specifically because really what we usually would say is, what do I want to be when I grow up? But I think this is this difficult time for every business owner when you have to ask yourself, a lot of times we ask people, what do they do? Right. And we think that explains who they are. But who you are is a much more difficult question.
It's
than
hard,
what you
man.
do. It's really hard. Like I've been
really
struggling with this.
hard.
My wife and I are sitting down over dinner tomorrow night, and we're going to be like, all right, who are we like now versus who we were 20 years ago? And what are we sure of? And what are we unsure of now? And are those the same things we were before?
By
And
the
I'm not
way,
talking about that from a relationship.
Don't know Tracy Ann, his
Yeah.
wife. She's the bomb.
She's amazing.
So
right? But we're
she
just like
is
going
the-
through this exercise ourselves to figure out what do we want to do with the rest of our lives, right? You know, we're in that early, I'm not 50 yet, but we're in the early 50s, and we're trying to decide, when do we want to retire? How much money do we want to make? You know, do we want to grow our businesses up much larger? Do we want to keep them lifestyle businesses? And I think the hardest part is this. I think, and I've been in some businesses that have been success, and I've been in some that have been total failures. And the hardest part for an entrepreneur is, if you think the business is you and you are the business, that's a real problem. You have to think of a business like a coat that you put on and you have the ability to take off. And if you can't do that, if you can't see yourself separate from the business, and if the business can't operate separate from you, that's a totally different
what
thing.
you've
Like,
done
that's in
is
an under 10 million range.
You've created yourself a job, not
You
a
have.
company.
That's a monster. And that's exactly what, and listen, there's times to do that. I'm not going to say that there's not. There's times where you have to, particularly early on, or if you're going through transition, where you have to metamorphosize yourself into that business in order to get it through and literally carry that thing across the finish line. But you've got to be able to get across the finish line and then say, okay, I got to take it off again. And I got to be able to step back from that. And I think that's one of those in that first categorical skill, I don't think you can ever grow your business past. And we're throwing numbers out there, $10 million. It might be 500,000 for you. It might be 50 million for you. But there is a point where you have to figure out how to separate yourself as an individual from your business. And sometimes it's hard. I had a CEO I did some coaching 4 years ago that was successful in his own right. And he wanted to take some time off, and he decided to take a month off as a sabbatical. And he was trying to prepare the business for him taking a month off. And he really believed that the business would struggle without him during that month. And he came back a month later, and the business was far more successful than it was with him there.
Yeah,
that was hard. Like, you could see it. Like, he knew that his little baby's all grown up and it didn't need him anymore.
So
that's hard.
So here's the thing. These would be the two things that I think people at this lower level, that doesn't mean it's not meaningful and purposeful.
Yeah.
I find in working with leaders at that level is one is to learn how to let go, which is what you taught, right?
Yep.
And the other is this idea of understanding how to learn how to get out of your own way.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many leaders at that level get in the way of the growth and prosperity of the business itself, right? Because they are the business, they can't view that. So I think those are the two mindset shifts. And then at the other level, there's different mindset shifts. I've worked with leaders of, I don't want to name a name, but a company that's putting in space stations around the moon, and the leaders of that company. And the mindset, even though some of them still don't know how to get out of their own way, the realizations are different that they have to deal with. Let's talk about that, Derrick. So you have been the president of a company that has been in the tens of millions.
Yeah.
What do you think it takes for the differences to be the leader of a company in the hundreds of millions than those in the tens of millions?
I think to explain this, I think you got to think through the stages, right? So we talked a little bit about that first stage where you are the company, and then you have to get into that point where you begin to separate yourself from the company. And I know a lot of times we talk about revenue, sometimes head count's even better. It's like if you can fit everybody in a minivan and take them to lunch, that's a micro business, right? It's very easy to manage. A lot of it is managed based upon your personality and your interpersonal skills. I think that next piece, you come into the point where you can delegate, but you also can jump in and do the work. And the biggest challenge in that stage, that let's just call that 10 to 30 million. The biggest challenge there is you believe that you are still an expert about how the business runs, because in the under 10 million you knew what knob to turn to get the machine to do the things you wanted to do. The problem is when you reach that next phase, you have to come to the conclusion all on your own that you're not the expert anymore, that your people are the experts, and that means something very, very different. And it means that this is why companies struggle so much with this. What tends to happen, and I see this all the time, they hit maybe that, and again, we're using numbers as sort of an explainer here, but they hit maybe that 11 to $10 million range, and they go down on the floor, let's just assume it's manufacturing, and they see something's broken and they try to fix it, or they try to take actions to get that thing to be fixed without understanding all of the interconnectedness of that now. So what they do is they come in and they think they're doing a good thing. Oh, I'm going to get this fixed. I'm going to get a new one of these. Let's just get it done. Bam. And they write the check and they get it done. And they don't understand the domino effect through the entire business, that they have just actually lost 10 or 15 or 20 steps. And I see this a lot where an emergency rises up, a fire rises up, and instead of the CEO sitting back and saying, okay, let me understand why we had a fire here, without grabbing a fire
and then ask five of those whys.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. That's the Japanese rule. So, but the problem is we try to put the fire out. Because when we were under that 10 million range, that's what we did. Like, we fought fires on a daily basis. Once you hit that next level, you're thinking about fires in a very different way. You're starting to think about fires not from a perspective of action, but a perspective of, okay, how do I adjust this business so that doesn't happen again? And I'll give you a really great example. I had an instance with a manufacturing company that I was the president of, that we were shipping out product all over the country, and we had a pretty well down in process. It was all published. It was up on the board. Everybody knew where everything was. I went out of town for a couple of weeks after I got everything established. And I came back, and the manager said, we have fixed something really amazing. We found an error in our system and we fixed it. And I said, great, what is that? And they said, well, we had 2 packages that were supposed to ship out. One was supposed to go to Florida. One was supposed to go to New York. And somehow we messed up the shipping labels. And we shipped them both to the wrong place. And it was this big disaster. And it was like Saturday afternoon. We're calling trucking companies. We're trying to get people out there. We're trying to do all these kind of things. And they said, so we've now changed the process to put this double and triple check system into place so that this can never happen again. Now, that sounds really good. But my first question was, well, out of the last 5,000 items we shipped, how many times has this happened? And everybody thought about it and thought, well, this was the only one time that's ever happened. So we've completely changed the entire process for 5,000 products, all because one got a little bit screwed up. Does that really make sense? Maybe what we really needed to do is look back and look at the data and say, how often does this happen? Is this really a problem? Is it something that should elevate to this level? So it's just really about becoming more of a critical thinker, I think, instead of just being reactionary.
I agree. So I would look at it in 2 ways, that elevation. One is, I love to play this game with my clients, and I ask them, I say, I want you to pretend your company is alive. It's actually a living, breathing being. Mm-hmm. And now I'm your company. And I ask you this question, Derrick, when you're doing a particular task, a regular task for me, of all the tasks that you do for me over the weeks, the months, the years, it's this particular task that I get by far the most out of you. What task is that? And I don't think executives really understand what that answer is, because that's what you should be doing, right? Whatever that task is. And if it's not as a CEO level kind of a task, then you need to start thinking about another CEO. That's number one. Number two, I would say, is start thinking about your company as an idea, a brand. And like, for example, Steve Jobs was maybe not a great leader as he was a great visionary, right? He wasn't as great an operator as he was a visionary. You know, the Apple brand stood for how it wasn't really about the computers as it was about what the computers could do to elevate your life in a lifestyle way they wanted to do it, right? And that was the idea, or to come up with something that could change your life and how we interact with others in it, right? A brand, an idea. And I don't think that a lot of CEOs, they think about differentiation, but they don't really think of it in terms of that. So I would say those two things, that and knowing what you're in a day-to-day, the best use of your time for that business.
Highest and best use is what it's all about, right? If you are worth $500 an hour and are doing a task that you could pay somebody $100 an hour to do, you've lost. You lose the game of business. That's just the way it is. And I think it's, again, early on in the business, that's hard not to do. I was talking with a CEO friend here recently, and he's an entrepreneur, sold multiple businesses. And I asked him, I said, what was the catalyst that made you an entrepreneur? And he said, I was working at a company that is now a bigger company, like a Fortune probably 2,000 or 5,000, or, pretty large company. And he said, I was there early on. as we were growing. And he said, one day I watched the CEO and COO digging through the dumpster in the back, pulling out broken chairs, like office chairs, and trying to fix them. And he's like, and that's when I realized these guys were out of their league. He's like, they were great up to that point, up to about 100 employees. But at that point, they just lost it, right? And they did. That company really struggled for a period of time until it got acquired and now it became sort of $1 billion empire. But he's like, that was a real indication for me that there was a problem in the business. I wrote this down as we were talking there. I think here's the 4 stages. I'm going to define them. And I've never thought about this before. First, I know it all. Right? I'm a business owner. I know how things get done because I'm the one that does them, or I'm there as those things are being done. The next is I think I know it all. And that's a real problem because you think you still know all the interactions and ways that the business work, but you actually don't. The next is I know nothing. And I get a lot of clients in that. They have just come out of I thought I knew it all. And then there was something that happened that they went, holy crap, I don't know anything about this business. I have no idea I don't know how the sausage gets made.
That's when they go in the bathroom and throw up.
Right. That's when you go in the bathroom and you throw up and you say,
come out, all right,
I am fine, right. What are they? Imposter syndrome, where you're like, I have no idea, how did I get here? It's like an 80s song. What is it? When the days go by, right? It's like, how did I get here? I said to myself, how did I get here? I have no idea how the hell I got here. then I think that there's this next piece, which you evolve past, which gets into this past this sort of 100 million. And that's, I now know my people are experts and I know what I'm an expert at. So I'm going to allow them to do the things that they're experts at, and I'm going to do the things that I'm an expert at. And I think that's where it really changes. When you really don't need to know anymore how the business itself works because you have enough trust in the people you've delegated to that they know how the business works. And that's a scary thing. And I think that is really where it gets tricky because, working through those stages is really hard. And each one of them is like death and resurrection as an individual.
Which is Joseph Campbell, right?
You've got to die in each one of those phases. So there's the I know it all. I'm the one that's packing the boxes. I'm the one that's writing the software. I know how things get done. Then there's the I think I know it all, where I still have that mindset, but behind my back, my employees are rolling their eyes a little bit going, ooh, shit, this guy's he doesn't get it. Then there's that next piece where I know nothing. You come to that realization. And then you can do one of two things when you hit that I know nothing. You can either become a control freak, which is what a lot of people do. They start working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. They start to interject. I want to be in every meeting. I want to be CC'd on every email. I don't want anything to ship out of here.
Those are the people I love to coach because those are the ones I can make the biggest impact with.
Well, absolutely you can, because they have to come to a realization that they don't know anything. And that's okay.
But what's beautiful about what you're saying is you're validating what my first reaction was, which they are mindset level and being level shifts.
Yes.
We could talk about the technical things you need to know more, but really it all starts here inside of your mindset. And exactly. I think what we should do is list those at the end of this video. And by the way, the book that I was talking about was Joseph Campbell, was the Hero's Journey, the Man.
Hero's Journey, right? Man of
there's an animation that you should all watch at the end of this video. It's a 5-minute animation that was actually
we'll put the YouTube link
at TED Talk animation that really is describing what Derrick is talking about, and that's so beautiful that you explained it that way. I mean, that's better than the way I would have explained.
Well, and I just came, and then, there's one more stage to that. And that is I make the market, right? You get to that next stage where you become that Steve Jobs. You've worked your way through the garage. You've worked your way through being involved in everything. You eventually, and Steve Jobs went through an interesting journey where he actually got fired from Apple, right? And I think he learned a lot in that time when he left Apple. He came back then going, I'm going to let them be experts at what they're experts at. I'm going to be an expert at what I'm an expert in. And then eventually you come to the point where you make the market, right? Where you actually say, okay, I'm large enough now that I really have to be the subject matter expert on the market. I'm going to lead and guide my company as a visionary into the future, but I don't manage the work that happens there anymore. I mean, if you really think that that, that Mark Zuckerberg is involved in the day-to-day. He's just not, right? He's making the market. He's making strategic decisions at a very, very high level. He's dealing with investors. He's setting up the roadmap for years to come.
Which is the brand. Think of your brand and how you perpetuate your brand to some destination that you envision. Yeah. Those are the true leaders that are the very best of the best. Know how to do that for a company and know how to get the company to execute on that vision. One of the things I always say, Derrick, the world is not lacking great ideas there. The world is lacking great execution on great ideas there.
But the challenge is that once you get to that top tier, you become a visionary again. You're not as much about the execution, right? You are truly making the market. And that is why it's so difficult for CEOs to make that transition. Because if you see yourself going that direction, and there's been a few that have been successful at it, and I would even say Zuckerberg has been pretty successful at it. He's out trying to be a visionary right now, talking about Meta, looking at the future, doing those kind of things. Maybe he might not be on the right track, but maybe he is. Time will tell. It's impossible to judge a CEO on what they do today. It's more about what happens to that company in the future.
It's like the stock market. If you're down, where you are in the stock market is where you are. But if you look back, it's gone like this, and 5 years later, it's up here. So it's
9% return every year. I mean, just because you lose one year doesn't mean you're going to lose the next, right? I mean, the average is the average when you look it over. But that's why it's hard for leaders to transition, and that's why I truly believe the smart leaders that I work with, they understand these stages, maybe not written out the way that I've done it, but they understand these stages, and they understand that for the year before they hit the next stage, or maybe even more, they have to do a lot of self-work. They have to change their management style. Well, and this is why I think going through these stages like this, and I'll define this out a little bit more and we can publish it. This is why CEOs, it's difficult to say, oh, I'm going to bring a guy in that worked at he was a CEO of Black & Decker. He'll be great as our new CEO. If he's only ever been in that stage 4 and 5, he doesn't have any clue how 1, 2, and 3 work. Very few CEOs have run the gambit, right? There's very few that have gone.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something I was going to bring up, is that, for companies that were a startup, and then it grew, and then it grew, and then maybe it went to 100 million. I guarantee you over 95% of all those leaders are no longer the CEO of that company when it became.
I was going to say that. I know some folks that have gone through 1, 2, 3, and 4 and got fired at 5. Right? I mean, that's this is why a job, people say, oh, I want to get board gigs because they're easy. My God, boards are terribly difficult, because many times it's telling somebody who carried this business on their back across a field of broken glass in barefoot for 10 years and saying to them, you can't do it anymore, right? And they go, oh my God, what are you kidding me? Like, I am this business. That's why I would give that analogy of the jacket, right? Being able to take that off and put it on. But
I think the message there is important that you're giving is that don't let your ego get in the way. Yeah. Just because it was your baby doesn't mean that you need to be the one leading your baby. Right? It still can be your baby without you running it and leading it. And I think that's where ego we get in our own way.
Right. I always remember, what was his name? The senator here from Arizona that passed away a few years ago.
John McCain.
McCain, right? I mean, his mom, was 90 some years old and still out there kicking. It's like, you're always somebody's little baby. Right. I mean, you might say John McCain ran for president, did all these things, but still he was, his mom, he's still her little baby. So you can have more than one identity. And I think, recognizing that with a business and saying, hey, a business has outgrown me and my ability to help it. And that's why I said early in this conversation, it's part of my wife and I's journey this year is saying, what do we want out of our businesses? Do we really want to go through this? Because I know what the next step is, and that is growing it up to the next level and then having to realize I have no idea how this thing works anymore, and going through that utter and total depression and feeling you're a loser and 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 the stress and not sleeping and going, oh my God, this thing's out of control. And then eventually realizing I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. Right? And then reconquering your position again. That's hard to go through. Sometimes it's just easier to say, it's just better if I know it all. And I just make the money I want to make and have my lifestyle business. But it's hard. It's hard to make those decisions.
Of us, look, COVID has kind of injected a new kind of reality, I think, into business consciousness. And one of the things I often submit is leaders included, we spend so much of our time in our lives chasing money. If you really think about it, we're just like units of chasing money. We're chasing, and some are way better at it than others, right? But at the end of the day, God forbid you're on your deathbed, you're probably not thinking about the biggest sale you made, the biggest leap forward, the things you've accumulated in your life. You're thinking about the people that mattered most in your life and the moments you shared with those people. I think we need, and one of the things when I work with leaders is I always ask them how they wish to be remembered, right? Because everybody's worked out their goals, they've worked out their, all this stuff, but they don't really, because when you think about it, when you start a business, Derrick, you start with the end in mind, which is essentially what we're talking about. What is the end in mind, right? But we don't think about our lives.
Yeah.
And that's what you're doing with Tracy Ann, is you're thinking about, okay, how do we wish to be, how do I want to be remembered? How do we want to be remembered? And I think that is something we all need to do. We need to start our lives with the end in mind and juxtapose that to our companies, to our leadership. At what level do we want to contribute? And where is our usefulness no longer needed? This was a great talk. If anybody has any questions or wants to follow up with Derrick or I, we always list and post our information there. Derrick is much more of a process. He has businesses, the process fixer. He is a process brilliant guru. And, I'm much more on the experience side and the culture side, the leadership side, and the customer experience. We'd love to help you in whatever way we can. And Derrick, it's always an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad we did it. Let's keep it up. I guess until next time, we'll see you next time on The Sauce.
The sauce is the key, we whipping it up. The sauce is the key, we cooking it up. The sauce is the key, we cooking it up.